right, any questions on this business?
I think so.
Div, ID attributes. There's a third attribute called a class attribute. And those would wrap up the three types of selectors in CSS. I mean, there's literally three types of things that you can do. Now, CSS can look pretty complex, and it can get more complex, but really it starts with those three things. You understand that there's three different types of selectors. This is how you use them. You got it done. You got it done. You know what I mean? Same with HTML. There are tags. They have various purposes. They define content. I know them, or I can look them up. And there's one called a div tag that helps me organize and divide my page and create zones. You know what I'm saying? Shelves in your closet. All right. So floating. Dun 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 dun. Floating. Floating's pretty confusing to a lot of folks, but there's a lab here. Because if you may have noticed that we haven't done anything that looks side by side, right? So floating can be a little bit cumbersome. So there's a lab involved with that. So I'm gonna go here. All right. Getting tags side by side. All right, so I'm gonna focus in on this because this is pretty easy. These two. Floating to tags. All right, we'll just go to the start. All right, so let me put the wrap on here. So here's my content, and I want this group of paragraphs to be side by side, column style. Okay, so this might be interesting. Well, we'll do that later. Alright, so I have a thing called ID equals content. So when you're floating two tags, they should have a parent that's defined by you. So that's rule one. It needs to have a parent because it creates a physical shelf to which those two tags can't interact with tags above it. All right. So it does have a parent. It's called content. So I'm going to say div ID equals, or I'm going to actually use a class this time. And I'm just going to call column 2. You should never start the name of an ID with a number.
Will those spaces affect anything?
Spaces here between those two?
Yeah.
They won't, but spaces here will.
Okay.
All right? But it's common practice to not have them because it just kind of saves on space. And believe it or not, white space will slow down your page by a micron of a second. And so as little of that as possible makes your page move that faster, which is important to most sites. So I'm going to wrap this first one. And so I'm clear on that. I'm going to indent that. Okay, so an ID works by just identifying one thing. But let's say you've got two areas that you want to operate almost identically. You can identify them with a class. So I'm going to copy this.
This would be good for just like across the board.
Across the board stuff. Yep.
Just want consistencies and stuff.
Sure, and if you can handle two birds with one stone, that's what you do, because it's efficiency is really key. If you look, let's go back to Apple since we were looking at that one. All right, so anything that's being treated similarly is a class. So there is a div around this, and there's a div around that, and there's a div around this. And it probably shares the same class. So you're zoning out things. You're saying, I want to create a zone, but I'm going to make it generic, and I want to operate. I want it to be the same width and height. I want it to act the same way. So that's when you use a class. Let's see if we can find another example. Blogs are good. Blogs. A blog. Blog awards. Blog about love.
Oh boy.
Be talking about love and stuff like that. Okay, so generally these zones like this, each little post would be a class. Does that make sense? So this, like this box that defines this area is a class. And as you can see, it has the same attributes, same width, same distance. So there's no reason why it would need an ID. You should just treat it the same way.
They all have the same class, just different content.
Yeah, yeah. And so like probably these add spaces would be classes. Okay? So that's kind of the difference, like why you use an ID. So an ID would be like the whole blog. We would say this is the shell. But things that you generically use over and over again, class. Okay? You could, say ID class 1, or ID equals add 1, ID equals add 2, ID equals add 3. But that's going to get pretty tiresome, especially when you're just typing the same thing in them. Width is 50, height is 100. Width is 50, height is 100. You just put a class and they all have the same thing. Alright, so there's a column 2. Alright, so I'm going to identify a class differently. So here are my IDs. They're identified with a number sign. Class attributes are identified. We'll do this at the top as well so we can see it. With a period or a dot in computer words. Computers, we refer to these as dots. So dot, and then you just give it the name that you gave it. I gave this the name of column 2. Meaning there are 2 columns or 2 columns side by side. With columns, with floating, there are several things that need to happen. Number 1, they need to be a width, a defined width. They will not float side by side unless they know how wide they should be. So width, I'm just going to say 100 pixels for now. That's pretty thin. Always save and test so you can kind of see what's going on. So let's go back to our preview here. Yeah, 100's crazy, but they're both 100. So let's say 300. Yeah. So there's one wrapped around these 2 paragraphs and one wrapped around these 2 paragraphs, and they're both 300. Then you could say float. Floating means this. Okay, if this tag is set to float, let's give this a background color too. Purple. Okay. I got this too. So that's see. Since I did that, I picked out an error. This I don't want in those 2 columns. I want it above those 2 columns. So awesome practice to do that, and I'll just cut and paste that outside of that, and it's no longer inside that. Okay. So floating says, okay, if there any if there's any tag underneath me, I want that tag to carriage over to my right or my left. Okay? So any tag. And so if this is set to float, any tag underneath it will carriage over to the left or to the right. All right? And then if any tag is underneath this, it'll carriage under to the left or the right. And then that's why it's important to have this kind of zoned out into a parent. That way, anything above it won't be affected. So column 2. So I'm going to just set this to float. Left. So there's float left and float right. They're a little too wide. So I'm going to say 230. Alright, now they float side by side. This is where a lot of folks get tripped up. See what happened to the green parent?
Hold up.
Collapsed. So this is one of the features of floating elements. Floating elements don't... Normally the content will stretch its parent, right? Those two tags when they weren't floating, I'm going to change those to float none. And their parent will stretch to accommodate the height of its two children. When they are floating, they do not accommodate that. Left is the most common. There's also a float right. And what it means is like this is set to float left, meaning I want to be the left of anything that's below me. And then anything underneath this will say I want to be left of anything that's below me. So that's what float left means. I want to put some distance between those two. What's that called? It is not. It's called margin. I'm going to put a shocker on your...
I'll figure it out. Figure it out one of these days.
Most people do. Okay, so 10 pixels. Something like that. That'll put some space in between those two. Yeah. All right, to get this to carriage back, you just have to target the parent, not the two tags that are floating. Don't forget that the thing that's collapsing is not these two. It is this green box. Okay?
So we have to get rid of the restriction on the width of the page for it to accommodate that, or
you just have to figure out what that green box is, which is called content. And the easiest fix, there are many other fixes, but the easiest fix is if you set the overflow. Notice it didn't turn blue until I spelled it right. The overflow property to auto. And then it'll stretch those two. But it's on the parent. Okay? So we're saying overflow auto. Now there's a lot of other fixes. The problem with this overflow auto is that if the floating content, let's see if we can make this happen. Sometimes I have trouble with this. Now that carriaged over.
It's saying if you make it too small, then it's on. If the parent is on auto, it will start collapsing with it.
It'll put a scroll bar in there. I'll try to simulate that for you next time. It's a very common error when something's like too big to accommodate, to accommodate its parent. Like if you can't get them to float side by side, often the widths, like this width plus this margin plus this padding has to be equal or under. If it's too big, then it screws up the works. It doesn't have room to float over. But what happens is you'll get a little side scroll bar and up and down scroll bar. Sometimes with this, as long as it's underneath the width, then you're cool.
You wouldn't have to define scroll bars in the code.
No, auto means if you need to scroll.
Oh, okay.
So what you can do, I know how to simulate this. Like content right now is still set to stretch, but if we give it a height, which you should always try to avoid if you can, it'll give it a scroll bar. And I think probably that's where that scroll bar comes in there. You can say overflow scroll and it'll automatically be there whether you need it or not. And there's some JavaScript scroll bars there too if you wanted to make one that looks better than that one. But that's essentially one of the problems. But that's the easiest one, and so that's the one I like. As long as these two widths and their margins are underneath the width, if you add them all up, if they're less than the width of this, then you shouldn't get any of those scroll bars.
Is there a way to affect the margin between the paragraphs? It will automatically like it's even on one side, uneven on the other.
Yeah,
center line maybe.
You can't really center, like there's no like center my stuff really. There should be like a float center. That would be awesome, but there's no such thing. So you also just have to do the math. Like to get these equal, you say, okay, I need this to be I think 250 is the magic number. But you just have to do the math. Like this content has a width of whatever I set the shell to. Okay, so my max width is 600, but there's a padding of 20. So that's actually you have to factor that in. So this is 600, and so you just do the math as far as that's concerned to get it all perfect.
I wasn't sure it was a numbers game or if they had an auto thing for that.
Not yet. Some things can automatically do, but often it's still like all these types of things have to equal. Problems in that are border will add to your width, and so if you have a 1 pixel border and it's say 300 pixels wide, it's actually 302. Padding does the same thing. If it has 2 pixels padding around there, now it's actually 304. So
I know sites can vary, but is there kind of a pseudo standard for the pixel width for sites?
Excellent question. Yes, there is a width for that. So when we went to media queries for the responsive stuff, some are, because screens are getting bigger and bigger, but this width from here to here, not here to here, but here to here, the content width is 960, 975, something like that.
So
but
I heard about a 960 grid system.
Sure, yeah, and this is a 960 grid system. They're 12 columns or 16 columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there are 12 columns, and this is 960 pixels, and so the math works out really well for that. So you see this kind of layout where it's divided in this way, and it has 3 columns of things that you need. So you see this, and this is a 960 grid. Excellent question. Yes, 960, and then under 960 is like your tablet upright,
Right.
and then under that number is like fat mobiles, and then to smaller mobile. So like 320, I think it is, and then it's like
You turn your phone on the side, you get.
yeah, you get something wider. Yeah.
I still say fat mobile shouldn't exist though.
Yeah.
No one needs a tablet for a phone.
Yeah, those big galaxies
Yeah,
that are
drives me
humongous.
nuts.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna start walking around with an iPad and acting like it's a phone.
Yeah. Yeah. You could just Skype. You could have an iPad mini with a service and then just Skype. Okay. Good question. So that's floating. You also float nav elements pretty frequently. So I teach you that inline. Everybody remembers that, but they never remember that LIs are actually a box that you can manipulate. So let's go ahead and do that real quick, and then we'll be done with floating. So here's my nav LI and my nav UL. So those are contextual. I'm just selecting UL tags only in those nav ID attributes, those tags with the nav ID attribute. So if we look here, UL and LI, but only in a tag that has that ID nav. Okay, so we've zoned that out, and we're targeting its parent first, and then the element itself. So I'm going to take those list items off. List items. Maybe not.
Is it spelled out?
It's called list style type. There we go. None. Okay, so we save that. Took those off. Okay, so let's target these blue boxes. Okay. So if we look, we need to concentrate on okay, these things are boxes, right? This UL is a box, and it's the red one. The nav is gray, the UL is red, the LIs are blue, and then there are A tags inside those. Okay, so we've got a shelf, a shoe rack, and then cubbyhole, 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 and then the A tags are the shoes inside the cubbyhole. All right. So what tags do we want side by side?
You want the LI tags?
The LI, the blue ones. Those are the cubby holes.
Right.
All right. So if we just look and we don't really know the structure, we just say, okay, there's blue, so I wonder which one's blue, right? I wish I just said blue, but that OFF is blue. If we put in number sign OFF in here, maybe it'll give us that color. Not good. Yeah, OFF. So there's one way. There's always ways to figure that out. So let's make those side by side, and we make those side by side by saying float left. And there they go. All right.
Nice and legible.
Nice and legible. So I want to put space in between those. What do I use for that?
Yeah, I'm not gonna say anything.
Margin. Margin right. 10 pixels. There we go. All right.
So what we do for the even box, like look, the consistent size of the box.
If you want a consistent size, you give it a width, but you want to give it a width to accommodate the biggest one.
Right.
So I'm gonna start with like 50 pixels, and I was just like, it's in pixels, and I go in increments of like 50s and 100s, 5s, 10s, 15s, and then after a while, you keep doing that. You know, a lot of students just uneven is a little too small there, so we'll do 60. They get caught up on they can't really visualize a pixel, and I recommend you just start in increments of hundreds, 50s, 10s, and then you'll start to get kind of what a pixel width is. Like, it's about this, you know what I'm saying? So about 100.
Base 5 maybe.
What's that?
Base 5, like 5, 10, 15.
5, 10. Sometimes it's if with big elements, it's like increments of hundreds or 50s.
For the 960 though, you'd want to do like 4.
It's an increment of 4 or 8. Yeah, for sure. But sometimes I'll just take off a couple pixels so I can just work in 10s. If you're really sharp, sometimes you just avoid numbers all the times. Like you can do percentages. You can say, okay, I want this to be 25%, and that's half. But that's more advanced stuff. So those are even buttons, like you'd. If you wanted all this on the right, you could get real clever, and you can't float the LI tags right, because I'll show you what happens. This is 2, 3 uneven nested.
Just look at out of order.
They'll reverse them because it's saying anything underneath me I want to my right, or I want to be the right of anything underneath me.
When would you use something like that?
Well, I'll show you. It has a parent, and sometimes you just have a single element that you want on the right, and you just put it over there. But it has a parent, right? The UL. The UL is inside this nav. So if I wanted all of that over there, I could say, okay, I want the UL to flow right. And there it goes. So this is what happens when we get kind of this freaks a lot of people out. But let's not forget, it's on the right. Okay? It's just saying, like, anything underneath me, I want to my left. I want to be to the right of anything underneath me. And all that other stuff is underneath it. So that's what's happening. But if we create a shelf, it's inside something called nav. So I can do two things to that nav. I could do what I did last time. I could go to nav and I could say overflow auto. That works, right? Also, since the nav is often a defined height, I can just give it a height. That looks to be like 40 pixels, maybe. Not enough. Okay, so you can do two things. Heights to be avoided a lot of times because content grows page to page, and so you want to avoid that inclination of like, I want this to be a defined height. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. The goal of this, just like the other two, there are finished examples that are floating I always have the completed versions that you can look to use as examples. So these are clusters and these are actual classes. And so in this scenario, I've got a class, and then I've got float right, float left, class, float left, float right. Know what I'm saying?
Yep.
All right. Cool. So just like last time, I'll email these to you. I said 20 minutes. It's 25 minutes.